Welcome to eBuilder University's on-demand video training. If you'd like to learn more about additional training opportunities, please contact your account manager. Now let's jump into columns for resource management with cost.
Hello, I'm Roger Newman, a product analyst with eBuilder, and in today's session, I will be talking to you about our new Schedule Resource Management with Cost module and some new columns that are available once you've purchased the Resource Management with Cost option. On today's session, we will be reviewing 20 of the new columns that are available on the task Gantt chart once you have enabled Resource Management and Cost on your account. The first column that I will be discussing is the Assigned Resources column. And what this column will allow you to do is to select any resource that has been added to your account's resource pool. Once you select that resource, you can then pick any role that is in the resource roles that have been added to your account. And you can also enter the units, which is the desired percentage of an assigned resources workday. It's going to default to 100%. So on an 8-hour day, that means 8 hours a day that resource is available on that task, but you can change that percentage as you wish. So in eBuilder, when you go to your schedule and you have this module enabled, you'll see a column available called Assigned Resources. Once you have that column selected, go ahead and pick a resource from the resources that are on your account, and it will move to the top of that area. And you'll see you have the ability to pick a role. So these are roles that your eBuilder admin has configured on your account for resource roles. These are not eBuilder roles. So just be clear of that distinction. These are resource roles. So if your organization has certain roles that they like to report on, go ahead and pick the appropriate role. So in this case, I'm picking the role of engineer and then moving into the units column. So the units is the percentage of the resources workday that they will be working on that task, and it's going to default to 100%. But you can type in whatever percent you feel is appropriate and go ahead and close, and you will see that resource is now assigned to the task, to the selected task, at 50% of their time. Once the resource is assigned, you can drag and copy them to similar tasks that you want to use that same resource on. And then from there, you can add additional resources if you wish. Some things may require more than one person. So let's say I need to add a second engineer, and this engineer is also going to be assigned 50% of their time. You will now have 2 assigned resources on that task. The next column that I want to show you is the work column. And what work is, it's the total resource hours on a specific task. So in eBuilder, when I go back to my schedule, I will now add that column called work. And you'll see that it's going to populate with the number of hours. Wherever there's a resource assigned to task, you'll see the total work hours that eBuilder has calculated for that task. To briefly explain how work is calculated, on this task we have a resource, Mary Smith, assigned at 50% of her workday on a 10-day task. Mary Smith's normal workday is 8 hours a day, so 50% of her time is 4 hours a day. Multiplied by 10 days is how you see the 40 hours of work for that one task. The next column that I want to talk about is called baseline work. And what baseline work represents, it's the total resource hours on a task at the moment that the baseline was last set. In eBuilder, let me add the baseline work column. And you'll see that it has 0 hours for all these tasks. So the last time the baseline was set on this project, there were no resources assigned to any task. Once I go ahead and reset the baseline, it's going to ask me if I want to override the data in the baseline, and I do in this instance. Once I do that, you'll see that it immediately populates with the same work hours that existed at the time I just saved that baseline and set that baseline. So now I will go ahead and save my work, and this becomes my new baseline hours or baseline work. Now we're going to talk about the actual work column. And actual work is a calculated column. It's the work multiplied by the percent complete for a task. So that means the total resource hours on a task multiplied by the task percent complete. And it's the result of that equation. So in eBuilder, I will go ahead and add the actual work column. And right now it's going to be 0 because everything is 0% complete. But I will go ahead and progress some of these activities. So let's update this to 50% complete. And you'll see that the actual work is 20 hours because it's the total resource hours on the task, 40 hours times 50%. Next, we're going to look at the remaining work column. Remaining work is simply work minus the actual work that has been progressed on the activity. So I'll go ahead and add the remaining work column. And once I add that column, you can see that for the one task that has 50% complete and actual work is 20 hours, the remaining work is equal to 20 hours because it's 40 hours of work minus the 20 hours of actual work. For the other tasks where there's 0% complete, since the actual work is zero hours, the remaining work is equal to the work. Now we're going to talk about work variance. And what work variance is, it's a calculation of the work on a task minus the baseline work. So when that value is positive, that means that the current work projection exceeds the baseline work. When it's negative, it means that the work is currently less than the baseline work. So let's look at a task where I originally expected it would take 10 days. If I go ahead and change that duration to 15 days, it's now going to increase the work projection to 60 hours. And the last time I baselined the project, I expected to spend 40 hours on that task. If I bring in the work variance column, it will show me that I'm 20 hours over my baseline. Now we're going to look at the cost column. The cost column is the total resource cost on a task. And how that is calculated, we take the sum of each assigned resource's work multiplied by their corresponding rate plus burden. So once I add the cost column, you'll see that it populates with certain numbers. So let's take an easy one. We have 60 hours of resource work on task 30% design, and that has a cost of $6,000. That is because that resource, Mary Smith, has a rate plus burden of $100 an hour. So $100 an hour times 60 hours is how we end up at $6,000 for resource cost on that task. Next, we're going to look at the baseline cost column. The baseline cost column is simply the total resource cost on a task at the moment that the baseline was last set. So once I bring in the baseline cost, you'll see my baseline cost is different from my cost because at the time that I set the baseline last, I only had 40 hours of work, which was $4,000 of cost. But now I've increased my duration and my work has gone up, so my projected cost has gone up to $6,000. But you can quickly see what it was when you last set the baseline. Next, we're going to look at the actual cost column. The actual cost is the cost multiplied by the percent complete, which is the total resource cost on a task multiplied by the task percent complete. So let's bring in the actual cost column, and you'll see that the actual cost on a task that is 50% complete is $3,000. So the cost is $6,000 for that task, and the percent complete is 50. So 50 times 50% of 6,000 is $3,000. Now let's look at the remaining cost. The remaining cost column shows you the cost minus the actual cost. So let me add the remaining cost column. And you'll see that the remaining cost is equal to the cost of $6,000 on this task minus the $3,000 in actual cost, leaving $3,000 in remaining cost. Now let's look at the cost variance column. The cost variance is a calculation of the cost minus the baseline cost. When the value is positive, that means that the cost currently exceeds the baseline cost. A negative value means that the cost is currently less than the baseline cost. So in our schedule, I'll add the cost variance column. You'll see that it's zeros except for one task where my cost exceeds my baseline cost by $2,000. So it's cost minus baseline cost to get the value in the cost variance column. For the cost variance, I also want to show you that if we were to try to make an adjustment to make up the $2,000 that we're over by shortening a future activity, the variance can also be negative. So I've reduced my duration on a subsequent task, and now my cost is below my baseline cost by $2,000. That's the opposite effect. If things go faster than planned, you can save money against your baseline. Now we're going to talk about the columns that will link your resource costs to the cost summary, the cost module in eBuilder. So the first such column is the budget line item column. You will be able to select the budget line item, also known as the account code, which should be charged for resource cost against a task. The budget line item column is only available when the schedule is set to link task to budget line item. If you had set the schedule to link resources to budget line item, there won't be a column at the task level because each task can have multiple resources charging different account codes. So instead, you'll have to navigate to the task details pop-up and go to the resource tab. And then on the resource tab, you will be able to pick the appropriate budget line item for each resource. So let's add the budget line item column. You'll see on this particular schedule, I already had some selections there. For mechanical engineer, I'll go ahead and add another resource to a new item. And this time I'm going to have a different person charging time to a different task. And I want you to pay attention to the new column that I'm going to bring in called planned work. And you'll see that the planned work has hours on certain tasks, but not on other tasks. So in this task that I just added a resource for, there's 480 hours of work. The planned work is empty. And that's because the planned work is the resource hours that are linked to budget line items. So by bringing in the budget line item, I now can delineate which tasks are going to be showing up in my cost summary with cost because those costs are planned. They're now part of my project plan that I'm going to budget for. So that brings me to the definition of planned work. Planned work are total resource hours on a task that are linked to a budget line item. Next, we're going to talk about approved invoice work. What approved invoice work represents are resource hours on a task that are reflected on approved or paid invoices. So if your organization submits payroll against a project and they have the number of hours that were approved for payment against a certain task in your schedule, those resource hours are going to appear in your schedule as approved invoice work once those invoices have been approved or paid. So first, I will go ahead and add the approved invoice work column. And right now it's 0 because there are no resource hours on approved or paid invoices. So now I'm going to add an invoice for a payroll against a task. So what is new is you'll be able to select, once you pick a task that has associated with a budget line item, you'll be able to pick that task on your general invoice and pick the resource working on that task. And we have the ability to enter the hours that the resource has worked. So I'll go ahead and put 30 hours, $3,000, add that resource charge to that task in my schedule. And now I will go ahead and save this invoice, approve it, and once I go back to my schedule, you will see that I now have approved invoice work of 30 hours. That's for the 30 hours that I just approved on that general invoice. Next, we're going to look at a fairly complicated column. This is called estimated work at completion. And what this column shows are the hours, which are the sum of the greater of planned work or approved invoice work for every assigned resource on a task. Now, it's important to note that the approved invoice work only becomes a factor if it exceeds the resource's planned work on a task. And we're going to walk you through an example to illustrate how that would work. Let's go ahead and look at an example of a 60% design task with 2 resources assigned. We have an engineer, Craig, who has 40 hours of planned work, and Mary, another engineer that has 80 hours of planned work, for a total of 120 hours of planned work on that task. At this time, there are no approved invoices against that task, so there's 0 hours of approved invoice work currently. Now we're going to add a general invoice for that task. So we have selected the 60% design task, and we have one resource. I'll go ahead first with Mary Smith's hours, and she has charged 60 hours, and that's $6,000. And I'll also add Craig's time for the same task. But in this case, Craig is charging 50 hours of work because that's what he actually worked. And he is at a little higher rate, so we have an invoice for 110 hours, $13,500. I'll save and approve the invoice. And now I'll go back to my schedule and I'll see my approved invoice work is 110 hours. But keep in mind, Craig originally was only planned to work 40 hours and he billed 50 hours. So once I bring in my estimated work at completion, it's now gone up to 130 hours because Craig's actual charges were 10 hours greater than what were planned, and Mary still has some time left. So the estimated work at completion is the sum of the greater of the planned work or actual invoice work for every assigned resource. So since that's a fairly complicated concept, let me just walk you through it one more time. We had a 60% design task. Craig's planned work was 40 hours and Mary's planned work was 80 80 hours. So the total task had 120 hours planned. But after payroll was approved, Craig's approved work came in at 50 hours, and Mary's approved work is 60, but she still is not done. So her planned work remains 80. So what we have to do to adjust the estimated work at completion, we have to add the actual 50 hours of approved invoice work to the planned work for Mary, which hasn't changed. And now we have 50 plus 80 hours equal 130 hours of estimated work at completion compared to the original plan of 120. So that brings us to the next logical column, which we call remaining invoice work. What that is, it's the estimated work at completion minus approved invoice work. So this is what's still out there remaining to be invoiced in terms of hours. So looking at that same task where I have an estimated work at completion of 130 hours and approved invoice work of 110, when I bring in my remaining invoice work, it shows that I still have 20 hours remaining that has not yet been invoiced. Now let's talk about the planned cost column. Planned costs are total resource cost on a task that are linked to a budget line item. So let's take a look at a schedule where we are showing assigned resources on task and cost representing the total resource cost against these tasks. Once I bring in the planned cost column, you'll notice that the planned cost column only populates with dollar values only for items that have budget line items assigned. That's the distinction. They're resource costs that are linked to budget items, meaning these are costs that you want to account for when you plan your project budget. Next, we have the approved invoice cost field. That column represents resource cost on a task from approved or paid invoices. So once you pay a general invoice for payroll, those resource costs will be reflected as approved invoice costs in your schedule. Next, we're going to talk about estimated cost at completion. What that column represents, it's the sum of the greater of the planned costs or approved invoice costs for every assigned resource on a task. Note that this approved invoice costs component only becomes a factor when it exceeds the resource's planned costs for a task. So if we have a task with a planned cost for one resource of $6,000 and the other resource's planned cost is $8,000, that resource has a total planned cost of $14,000. Now, let's assume payroll comes in and one resource, Craig, has an approved invoice cost of $7,500, even though he was only planned for $6,000. We have to account for that. However, Mary's approved invoice cost is $6,000, but she still has more work to do, so she still will hit her $8,000 planned cost. But when we go to look at the estimated cost at completion, it's gone up because the approved invoice cost for Craig came in higher than his plan, so we have to use that. So we have to use the $7,500 for Craig and maintain Mary's planned cost of $8,000, adding up to $15,500 in a new estimated cost at completion compared to the plan of $14,000. And finally, there is a column which is simply the difference between the estimated cost at completion and the actual approved invoice cost. We call that remaining invoice cost. So again, remaining invoice cost is going to be your estimated cost at completion for a task minus whatever you have an approved invoice cost against that task, so you know what's left to be paid against that task. I truly want to thank you for watching today's session, and we look forward to you watching further episodes.
If you'd like to learn more about additional training opportunities, please contact your account manager.